Hello, dreamers, and welcome back to the show. This is the second part of a two-part series. We are discussing the April 2022 jailbreak from the Lauderdale County Detention Facility in Florence, Alabama, involving convict Casey White and corrections officer Vicky White. So if you haven't listened to part one yet, you're going to want to pause this one here, listen to episode number 288 first, and then come back to this. Before we pick up the story from where we left off, I have a few notes about this podcast. This is an independent ad-free show, which means I depend on you, the listeners, to help keep us going, and there are a few ways that you can help. You can leave a nice rating and a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whichever platform you listen to your shows on. That helps give us more visibility and drives the show up the charts. You can follow the show on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Like, comment, post, share, all that good stuff. You can recommend the show in true crime discussion groups and forums. And if you would like to go above and beyond, then you can become a Patreon subscriber, where for starting at just $1 a month, you will gain access to dozens of full-length episodes that you won't hear anywhere else. We are currently in the middle of a really interesting series on the murder of 15-year-old Seth Jackson out of Ocala, Florida. There's some good interrogation audio that I wanted to share with you because in this particular story, there are 6 defendants involved in the murder, and it's Florida, so it's like bottomless idiocy. So yeah, that is what is happening over on Patreon, and if a subscription just isn't your thing, and you'd still like to support, you can do so through PayPal using the email californiapod@gmail.com. And oh, just so you know, I also have Cash App now. It's $KD Podcast. So yeah, I have several new ways of begging for money. That's all I've got for the business junk. Let's get to the show. So in the first part of the series, I introduced you to Vicky White and Casey White, the corrections officer and the convict who pulled off a brazen jailbreak from the Lauderdale County Detention Facility on the morning of April 29th, 2022. We talked about how they did it, how long it took for authorities to realize that they were both gone, and once it dawned on everyone what had happened, how the investigation began and unfolded. We talked a little bit about Vicky's background and her life leading up to the day of the jailbreak. We also discussed Casey's criminal history and the cases that he caught over the years that ended up landing him that 75-year prison term that he was barely into serving when this escape took place. We discussed the couple's movements, the changing of their vehicles a couple of times, and how investigators picked up on their trail. We discussed how Vicky and Casey's relationship developed and how they got away with interacting with one another both in the jail and over the phone. We talked about how Casey was actually supposed to be in a maximum security prison at the time of the escape, but had been transferred back to the county detention facility as a result of a random confession to the 2015 unsolved murder of Connie Ridgway. And that is where we're going to pick the story back up from. It was in the summer of 2020 when Casey White confessed to killing Connie Ridgway. Back on October 23rd, 2015, which was only 2 months before his crime spree, in the town of Rogersville, Alabama, Connie, who was the mother of 2 adult sons, was stabbed to death inside her home. She was the first murder in Rogersville that anybody could remember, even likely the very first. And when I read that, I was like, really? And I looked it up, and yeah, Rogersville is a town of only about 1,200 people right now. So her murder was unsolved for about 4 years when, out of the blue, Casey White confessed by way of sending a note to the prison warden in which he confessed to killing her. So it sounded like a very calculated move to get back into the county jail, where Casey was well on his way to carrying out his escape plan. Now, authorities did say that when he confessed, not only did he say that he was paid to do the killing, Casey knew details that apparently only the killer should know. But there is a chance, when I thought about this, that Vicky was the one who Casey was getting buddy-buddy with, at the time that he was in the county lockup the first time. And I said earlier that he was sent back to the county jail where Vicky worked in February of 2022, and that's when the relationship between them picked up again. Well, I think I said it developed, but I should have said it developed again because they had a history of an inappropriate jailer-inmate relationship prior to this last transfer. So she actually could have been the one feeding him inside information that nobody else would know about, details about Connie's murder, in order to get him back into the county jail so that they could resume their escape plan. So investigators are going to have to reach back and try to find the real beginning of the romance between Vicky and Casey, because, could it have been a false confession? Sure. But the investigators said that they feel like they were able to corroborate some of the details that Casey provided in his confession. They wanted to make sure that there wasn't anything Casey stood to gain for this confession, but it seems like the gain was getting back into the prison or the jail that has more lax security for him to be able to run his game on Vicky, If this was a false confession and his goal was to get back into the county jail and to run off into the sunset with Vicky, then he did stand to gain the freedom to make that happen for himself with the help of this prison guard girlfriend of his. Casey was asked why he decided to confess, and he never really fully explained himself, but one thing is for sure. Security was much more minimal than the maximum security prison that he had been sent to serve his 75-year sentence. Shortly after Casey got to the prison, he recanted his confession and entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of this episode. Apparently, Casey's reputation at the county jail was that he was feared. He used his size to bully and intimidate people, but he was also just a really violent guy. No matter what size a person is, they can be violent and choose violence on a daily basis, whether they're a little pipsqueak or whether they're 6'9". ABC interviewed a former cellmate of Casey's named Jorginho Lopez, and he stated, quote, "He acted like he was better than everybody else, like he could whoop anybody. To tell you the truth, I was scared of Casey. Of course, a murderer, you're gonna be scared of him." The county jail does have its fair share of violent offenders, but authorities say that the county facility really isn't equipped or set up to house a person like Casey White for a long-term stay. He's someone who really needed to be in a maximum security prison at all times. So after he confessed in the summer of 2020, in November of that same year, that is when they found that shank in Casey's cell and immediately sent him back to the maximum security prison. But investigators by then believed that the relationship between him and Vicky had already begun, and after he was sent back at the end of 2020, the lovebirds did stay in touch. When they looked at all of the phone calls that Casey made from prison to try and connect him to Vicky, because remember when they found out from Vicky's parents that she had rented a storage unit, and inside that storage unit, investigators found a burner cell phone? Well, when they cross-checked the number of her burner phone to the numbers that Casey White was calling from the prison, they hit pay dirt. The two of them had spoken pretty regularly through the jail phone system from the time that he was sent back to the prison to the time that he was returned to the county jail for some hearings on Connie's case in February of 2022. And it was pretty clear that this relationship was not only hugely inappropriate, it was also intimate and sexual. And those phone calls started exactly in November of 2020, right when he was sent back after the discovery of that shank in his cell. Of course, all of those phone calls were recorded, and when investigators were able to take a listen, it was only then it dawned on everybody just how deeply involved Casey and Vicky were and just how far their relationship had gone. All of this right under their noses. The investigators, some of them listened to almost all of the calls between the two of them and noted that Almost all of them were very, very personal, intimate, and sexual. And as I was writing this script and all my notes for this episode, I got reminded of an interrogation that I watched not too long ago on YouTube. I think I watched it a couple times. It was another female corrections officer who began an inappropriate relationship with an inmate as well. But this was an interrogation, and she was confronted, and it was so cringe to listen to. Maybe I'll go ahead and tack on a bonus episode with that audio recording. It's not too bad a quality. The officer isn't really that annoying to listen to. I mean, come on, it's hard enough to want to listen to yourself talk on a recording, right? Imagine being her and sitting there and having to listen to yourself talk about giving a blowjob to an inmate with the detectives in the room interrogating you. And you're listening to phone recordings of yourself getting all giggly and giddy like a teenager with a crush. Yeah, let's do that interrogation next. That one is a case out of Texas. So that'll be fun and cringy. So yeah, Casey and Vicky were heard on some of those recordings engaging in phone sex. By day 5 of the escape, the media began to report on the information or the rumors going around that Casey and Vicky were involved in an inappropriate relationship. But at that time, when Sheriff Singleton was asked if the relationship was sexual, he said that it was, but not physical. However, that fact would change as soon as they would start to listen in on some of the jailhouse recordings. In the about year and a half or so from November of 2020 until the escape in April of 2022, investigators discovered more than 1,100 recorded phone calls between Vicky and Casey. And like I said, much of it was sexual in nature, but they could see, once they listened, how much Casey was manipulating Vicky in many of these phone calls. He would be sitting there telling her how beautiful she was and how much he loved her, all the sweet nothings and all the sweet everythings. And then shortly thereafter, you would be able to hear Casey asking for favors or asking for money or asking her to make phone calls for him on his behalf. And for Vicky's part, it was described as her sounding like a woman who was completely head over heels in love with this loser. Investigators being interviewed about this case were perplexed by what it was that drew Vicky to Casey. However, for me, and many of my dreamers might understand as well, I don't really think it's that big of a mystery. I don't want to put Vicky down or bash her for having feelings for this guy, but it really doesn't take a whole lot to woo a middle-aged, childless, single woman who's moderately successful in life. Men like Casey are good at it. They point to Casey's violent background and why she would be wanting to be intimate and close to somebody like that. But he got to her. He knew exactly how to get to her. And, she probably feels safe and comfortable because he is locked up. He might have a violent history, but she's probably thinking, I'm safe. He likes me. I like him. He's not going to do anything to harm me, right? I mean, I guess that's the thinking. Clearly, Vicky was a ride or die kind of a woman. She got to a point in her life when she was just done with the same old, same old. And honestly, dreamers, I'd be lying to you if I didn't say that I get it. Violent or not, Vicky was prepared to die, whether it be by his hand or her own hand or with the violent shootout with the police. She was ready. No matter how much I sit here or we sit here and try to rationalize all of this, I would also have to say that if it were one of my friends and she was trying to run off with a murder suspect by breaking him out of her workplace, I'd probably freak out too, just like Vicky's friends and colleagues and loved ones did. And there was nothing that Vicky ever said or did that gave any indication that she had this fling going on with this inmate. Nobody knew. Nobody had any clue. She kept it all completely to herself. She never even talked about him. She couldn't, So Everyone is sitting here today and wondering how and why this all happened. Investigators think that there might be some answers in Vicky's personal life and in her relationship history. And looking back on it, her friends at the jail, the ones who she worked closely with for so many years, it began to dawn on them that when they thought about it, they really didn't know Vicky as well as they thought they may have. She didn't open up a lot about her personal life. She didn't mention dating or love interests. One of her coworkers interviewed about Vicky said that she asked about her dating, but Vicky remained kind of quiet and didn't really seem to want to talk about it. One of Vicky's colleagues, a sheriff sergeant that she worked with named Matt Burbank, he said that Vicky did open up to him a little bit about her past. He was familiar with her family. He knew that she had been married. Her husband, who I mentioned earlier, Vicky confided in Matt that he had struggled with substance abuse problems where it would eventually cause Vicky to walk away from the marriage. And the failure of that was devastating for Vicky. She expressed to her colleague Matt Burbank and a handful of other close coworkers and confidants that she was heartbroken over her divorce. Despite the marriage not working out, Vicky still loved and cared about her ex-husband very much, and they remained close to each other and to each other's families. Vicky did eventually meet another man, but she didn't have better luck the second time around. But in this relationship, it left Vicky devastated a second time when a short time after the couple became engaged to get married, he was involved in a car accident, and it was an accident that he did not survive. It was said by those who were close to Vicky that after she and her husband divorced, it seemed as if she had built up some walls around herself. She just was kind of closed off to the idea of letting anybody into her heart again. And then when she eventually did open herself up to a new relationship and he ended up passing away so tragically and unexpectedly, Vicky's walls went up yet again. She told her friends and family that she was done with the whole dating scene and decided to just stay focused on herself and her career. It wasn't until this brazen jailbreak with Casey White did Vicky's friends and colleagues realize that they didn't know Vicky as well as they thought they once had. They knew that Vicky was fiercely private and very guarded with her personal life. And it started to become clear that because most of her friends were her coworkers, they spent most of their time socializing right there at work. And they really didn't get together all that much with Vicky outside of that detention center. In fact, some of Vicky's coworkers never saw her outside of work. And they did do stuff together when they were off. They did go out and they did socialize and they did invite Vicky, but she almost always declined. In fact, Judge Medley said, "All of us thought that we knew her. All of us that had contact with her and a relationship with her, but obviously we didn't know her. I realized that I was her colleague, but I wasn't her friend." They all just figured that if there were any signs that something was going on with Vicky, they all missed them, every single one of them. But looking back on what happened to Vicky and what she ended up doing with Casey White, they figured that Vicky was suffering. She was dealing with a great deal of pain and doing so very privately and keeping all of that hurt bottled up inside her. And then what ended up happening is it opened her up to being vulnerable, to be manipulated, and to be taken advantage of. Nobody was prepared for what they would learn as to just how deep the relationship between Casey and Vicky had become. And like I said earlier, all of it was right under their noses. The sheer magnitude of the phone calls between Casey and Vicky was a clear indication of just how involved and how close the two had become. And all of it was happening with Casey being either in the county jail or at the prison, so all of it was recorded, of course. Investigators had to sit and listen to every single one of those phone calls, and apparently almost all of them ended in phone sex. And they were able to get away with it because of Vicky's position at the jail as Assistant Director of Corrections. There was only one person that had seniority over Vicky, so nobody was checking up on what she was doing. And if she did anything that seemed questionable or out of line, it was overlooked. And of course, those phone calls with Casey went to her burner phone, which she had obtained under an alias. And because Vicky was basically second in command of the county detention centers, if there was something that Vicky wanted to do, like have some privacy in an area of the jail where she knew there were blind spots to the surveillance, she would be able to send other guards or employees to other duties around the jail and then do what she wanted to do with Casey. I'll get into more details about that in a little bit as well. And the fact that Vicky was able to get away with what she got away with for the better part of almost 2 years just goes to show that not only how covert she and Casey were, but also how trusted she was. But to this day, anyone who knew Vicky or anyone related to this story completely places the responsibility of the escape squarely on Casey White. He was the career criminal and the master manipulator who, more or less, they want to think or say brainwashed Vicky into doing what she did. Though I have to say, considering what we know about Vicky, she seemed to have gone through some deep trauma in her 2 significant relationships that she had had, her 1 marriage and her 1 engagement, neither one of them working out for her. Both men ended up passing away, and her ex-husband and her fiance, they both died. The husband died of, I believe it was prostate cancer. The fiance, like I said, it was a car accident. Even though her husband with the cancer, that was something that she had probably seen coming for quite some time, the car accident was definitely something that blindsided Vicky, and it seems like that changed the course of what she was doing with the last years of her life. The day that she left that jail with Casey White, Vicky was on a personal mission. She was either gonna ride or die, but whatever was going to happen, Vicky had no intentions of ever being back behind the walls of any jail or prison, either as a deputy or as an inmate herself. Vicky White was never coming back. As the hours and days ticked by and the 2 fugitives remained on the run and able to elude capture, investigators were confident that the 2 of them would not be able to keep up the pace that they were running at. It's them against multiple law enforcement agencies, multi-state agencies, local, county, state, and federal. So Vicky and Casey are being hunted by an entity with basically unlimited resources. The 2 of them, they need to keep running. If they stop, they need to hide, and they need to hide very well. They can hide in their car, but they gotta eat. They gotta sleep. They gotta go to the bathroom. They gotta get gas. They're quickly becoming 2 of the most recognizable people in America, and all of those law enforcement agencies have that advantage too. The advantage of the media, the internet, the community, and the general public. And unlike Vicky and Casey, law enforcement doesn't have to stop for anything. They are searching far and wide for Vicky and Casey around the clock, and they're not going to give up until these 2 are captured. By day 6, which was May 4th, 2022, the jailbreak and search for Casey White and Vicky White was topping the headlines across the United States. And the media interest in the case was bolstered by the emerging details of the relationship between Casey and Vicky and how that developed between the convict and the corrections officers within the confines of the Lauderdale County Detention Facility. I clearly remember following this case in real time and signing up for breaking news alerts related to it, and I remember being captivated by the story and wondering if they would get caught, or if it was possible that they would never be seen again. I understand that Casey White is a man that needed to be caged, but I was really kind of swept up in the story and admittedly romanticized the whole thing. And it just kind of reminded me of another story that I just watched on a documentary about an extramarital affair and a murder-suicide, and during the story, it was said that everyone involved in the case was kind of vilified because of the way the whole thing played out. But while I was watching it, I was feeling like this love story and marriage and affair, like the whole thing to me, was more sad and heartbreaking than turning all of these people who really betrayed one another into villains. And I think one of the reasons why I was able to not really make all these people out to be completely terrible and morally void is because there were no children involved, and it felt like everyone was following their hearts and they just couldn't help it. It wasn't like the husband was having affairs left and right, one right after another. This was a man who was married to the same woman for nearly a quarter century. They never had any children together. They kind of just tried to enjoy life together as husband and wife and companions, but at the same time, they'd been together for so many, many years that they loved and cared about each other very deeply. But they also struggled financially, and the relationship just seemed to sort of grow stagnant. It was like year in and year out, the same old, same old, same old, and nothing was changing. Nothing was getting better, nothing was getting worse. The relationship was just kind of stale. And something powerful came along in a chance meeting that just swept all of these people off of their feet. And they could not stop how they were feeling. Like, I don't condone having extramarital affairs, but I understand having that strong need to follow your heart. And I think I wanted to tell you that story too, though some of you may have heard it. I'm like feeling like these tragic love stories lately. I don't know why. I guess since over the past few months, I've been talking about Sandy Hook and Sherry Papini and Seth Jackson, and none of those are remotely close to being a good love story, except for maybe Sherry Papini, who is madly in love with herself. I think I have the next two episode topics that will bring us to 290 and episode 290 and 291. So we're getting really close to 300, and I'm very excited about that. But anyway, the media was all over the Casey White and Vicky White story, and it was really unlike anything Northern Alabama had ever seen before. And one of the members of law enforcement even said in his interview that people love a good love story, but this is not the one. Well, it kind of was, and that was what was playing out in the media. But at the time, looking for this dangerous fugitive, I get the urgency and the need to not get too caught up in the romance of it all. But I can't lie to you, I was caught up, and that might be annoying, and I don't want to sit here and tell you I was cheering on the U.S. Marshals, because I was not. I wasn't cheering Vicky and Casey on either. It was just like if they didn't ever reappear, I wouldn't have been mad at it. That's all. That's all I'll say. Let's stop for a minute and talk a little bit about how Vicky got away with carrying on this romantic relationship in the county jail. Because as it turned out, the relationship was physical too. How did they manage to go undetected for so long? ABC was able to go inside Casey White's actual jail cell that he was in at the time the escape happened. So he was in a cell with anywhere from 8 to 14 other people. And one of the men that was in the cell with him for a time was that gentleman that I mentioned earlier, Jorginho Lopez. And he reported that he had also developed a close relationship with Vicky. Jorginho did. I don't exactly know how involved he got with Vicky, but in his interview he said that Vicky was the type of deputy who cared about the inmates, that she was very kind-hearted and very sweet. Jorginho Lopez also said that it was sometime while he was there in 2017 or 2018 that he got placed in a cell that was close to her station so that she could have him close to her. And this would go on to be the same cell that she would assign to Casey White later on. And according to Jorginho, when Casey White was brought back to the county jail from the maximum security prison, he would see something in Vicky change. And yeah, she likely very quickly became interested in Casey when she first started to develop this relationship with him. And then when he got back in 2022, it was already full-blown like in love, right? So she was no longer interested in Jorginho Lopez. And he said that is when he first got to know Vicky. When he first met her, she was the type of deputy who always followed the rules and the protocols. But in the months leading up to the escape, Jorginho saw a noticeable change in Vicky. For example, she used to walk up and down the hallway to talk to the other inmates in their cells periodically. But after Casey got there, she stopped doing that and would just kind of stand around and linger near Casey's cell, and it would be the cell that was closest to her post and her work area. From that spot, Vicky had a direct line of sight right into Casey's cell. One of the things that Vicky used her position as assistant director was making some unusual changes to Casey's cell that nobody else got, including a shower curtain that she installed that was near a window where anybody on the other side of the window could look in and see someone taking a shower. And that was the reason Vicky gave for putting up the shower curtain, to give the inmates privacy from anyone passing by that window. However, anytime Casey was in the shower, Vicky would be standing in the window and they would be watching each other. And because Casey was so tall, he would just be able to see over the shower curtain and look at Vicky through the window. And from there, he was said to be pleasuring himself while staring at her. Another thing Vicky did when it was time for the inmates to go outside into the yard, she would always allow Casey to hang back in his cell by himself, and they'd be alone inside the jail while everybody else was outside. And there were no cameras in those cells, and that's when it is believed that Casey and Vicky would have intimate relations, right there in the cell during yard time. So a question gets raised whenever this case is discussed. Who was the one in control of this whole thing, Casey or Vicky? Vicky's friends will say it was all Casey, and that Vicky was in a very vulnerable, weak, and easily manipulated state of mind following the tragic deaths of her ex-husband and her fiancé. They believe Casey happened upon Vicky at just the right time in her life and honed in on her weaknesses right away. And so the big fear was that once Casey got to where he wanted to go, that he would get rid of Vicky, that he would kill her, because once he felt like he made his way to freedom, Vicky would be nothing but a hindrance to him. This was pretty much the general consensus among Vicky's loved ones, that once Casey didn't need her, she's history. However, all of that is based on what happened in the lead up to the escape. On Vicky's part, when we're talking about her role in all of this with her burner phones, the storage unit, the cashing out of her 401k, the selling of her house, the moving home to her parents, the purchase of the getaway cars, the purchase of the guns, and leaving behind in her bedroom in plain view her purse, her will, her life insurance information. It kind of tells me that Vicky was okay with dying, and if this didn't work out, then she was gonna go. If she couldn't get away to be with Casey, she was completely comfortable with taking her own life, and I believe she made that decision in advance. She was never going to come back home to her parents' house. That was made clear in what she left behind in her bedroom. She wasn't coming back to go to prison for this either. If Vicky couldn't have Casey, then she would choose death. In order to assess the risk that Vicky was taking or the potential danger that she was in, the FBI behavioral unit listened to some of the phone calls between her and Casey to try and get an idea of what was going on with this man psychologically. They really wanted to know if Vicky was at risk of being harmed by Casey. By the 6th day of the escape, the FBI provided a report that indicated that there was the potential for Casey to consider Vicky to be more of like a grandmotherly type of figure in terms of his relationship with her. They came up with this idea from some phone calls that Casey had with his mom when they were talking about Vicky. He says that she's kind of like his Mima, except they're having a sexual relationship. That's a big difference that you don't have with your Mima, I hope. 1 week passed without authorities having been able to catch up with the escaped convict and the corrections officer. But the FBI had been able to get a pretty clear picture of exactly what has been going on with Vicky in the time leading up to the escape. They had spent time going over her financials, and it had taken everybody aback by just how long Vicky had been planning and preparing for what she and Casey ultimately did. And in their digging and investigating, it did give them at least one new direction to go. With some of the purchases and preparation, it seemed like the couple might have been headed to try to hide in the woods or in the wilderness to try to go off the grid. It was evident that they were looking for living arrangements that were somewhere very remote. For example, Vicky would be going to Walmart and most of her purchases would be normal, day-to-day things that you would get on a trip to the grocery store. But then she would buy a package of waterproof matches in one trip. And then in another trip, she'd be getting milk and eggs and the regular stuff that you would buy, and then she'd throw in a big tarp. So after 1 week on the run, the investigation starts looking towards places where they might be setting up camp. And while multiple law enforcement agencies on every level are working around the clock to track Vicky and Casey down, after 7 days they still weren't any closer to having any idea of where the couple were at, nor have there been any confirmed sightings of either one of them thus far. One of the earliest and biggest mistakes that Vicky made in her planning was that bright orange Ford Edge that she purchased as a part of their getaway plan. They were actually glad, but also kind of confused as to why would she have picked such a conspicuous car. I mean, to me, where I'm from in Southern California, colorful cars don't particularly stand out from one another, but I can imagine when you're in an area that might be more rural with less population in the South like that the orange SUV would probably stand out a little bit more than it would in California, or even here where I'm at in Southern Nevada. Not only are there tons of cars, there are cars from all over North America, but when you have information going out among law enforcement and the community, having a car as specific as the one that they had to broadcast over their bulletins and their be on the lookouts in the media, it definitely narrows it down drastically in terms of what car to be keeping your eyes peeled for, as opposed to like, oh, they're driving a white Ford F-150. You know, there's like a million of those in the South, right? So on day 8, they got a tip from a tow yard in Tennessee that they think the orange Ford Edge is there in their yard. This would take us to May 6th, 2022. Investigators descended on the tow yard to get a look at the SUV. They find out, based on when the car was picked up by the tow company, that Vicky and Casey dumped the Ford Edge the very first day of the escape. They could see on the outside that there had been some attempt to alter the color of the car. It was believed that Casey was the one who took issue with the bright orange SUV. The small orange car stood out like a sore thumb to him. So they had stopped somewhere to purchase some cans of spray paint in an attempt to change the color of the car. And you can see that they started to paint the car. It looks like it's either black or green or something. And all it did was make the car stand out even worse. They began painting the passenger side rear panel, and yeah, it just looks bad. They didn't even get that one panel completely painted before giving up. And they showed a picture of the inside of the passenger floorboard where they had at least 7 cans of what looks like pine green spray paint. They ended up abandoning the car, but in doing so, they left behind some breadcrumbs for investigators to follow. And one of the pieces of evidence left behind was the receipt for the cans of spray paint. Investigators were able to go to that store and look at the security cameras in order to see if they could get a glimpse of either Vicky or Casey or the both of them. Who they ended up seeing, to their surprise, was Casey himself, not Vicky. Even though he is standing out because of his size, to his credit, it does appear that he's wearing real tree camouflage along with a baseball cap. That would stand out where I'm from, but in Alabama, seems like it would blend in pretty well with the locals, even though he's tall. And this is all happening on the very same day of the escape, day 1. You can see him holding a whole bunch of spray cans in his arms along with a Red Bull, and he used cash to pay for everything. So now they know that Casey isn't worried about getting out of the car to make purchases. It is, again, brazen, but this is still day 1, and the couple had a more than 6-hour head start So when he's in that store buying those cans of spray paint, it's likely that nobody is even aware that they're gone. But the one thing that they do know now is that Casey and Vicky were no longer in that orange Ford Edge. They have another car. Now investigators just have to try and figure out what they're driving around in now. As they investigate and canvass the area where the Ford was abandoned, authorities on the case discover a major clue. They found a person in the local area who sells vehicles out of his yard, and it turned out that he sold a, quote, tall guy a truck. He was with a lady who was driving an orange car. They found out that the vehicle that this man sold, who turned out to be Vicky and Casey White, was a dark blue Ford F-150. So slightly less conspicuous, I guess. F-150s are everywhere. I recently just saw a story on Dateline about this lady who killed her daughter-in-law or ex-daughter-in-law in a Target parking lot. And this happened back in Georgia in 2011. And through the investigation, it was discovered that a white Ford F-150 was seen leaving the scene of the shooting shortly after the killing had happened. When investigators got that information, everyone was like, a white Ford F-150? Great, those are literally everywhere. But there was something different about this particular Ford, as it had some sort of aftermarket trim on it that one of the witnesses just happened to notice. They had a suspect in the shooting who they knew drove a white F-150. So when investigators took that witness driving past the home of the suspect where that vehicle was parked, they didn't tell the witness that they think they might know where the Ford truck that he saw was to try not to lead him on. But yeah, they drove him by there, and the witness identified the truck and that aftermarket trim that stood out to him. And that's how they managed to narrow down that vehicle. Even though investigators now have this information about what Casey and Vicky are now driving, it is going to take some time to get the information on the truck. The details like the license plate, the VIN number, the registration, and the like. Authorities are still a couple of days behind the fugitives, but they are making progress, especially now that they have this new vehicle information. And it was only a short time later that they did find the actual truck itself, and it had already been recovered. It was found sometime around day 4 or 5 in the town of Evansville, Indiana, which is a couple hours north of where this whole story began in Florence, Alabama. So the FBI immediately got in touch with their agents in that area to get them involved now that there is confirmation a vehicle connected to Casey and Vicky was recovered there, which means they must be in yet another different vehicle. We're going to back up a little bit in the timeline. We're going to go back to May 3rd, 2022. We're talking 5 days into the escape. A gentleman by the name of James Stinson discovered an abandoned blue F-150 parked at a self-serve car wash that he is the manager of. The truck was parked in one of the bays and I guess had been parked there since the early afternoon the day before. So when he showed up on day 5 of the escape and it was still there, James Stinson went ahead and called it to be dealt with or towed or whatever. The thing that was strange is that the keys were in the vehicle too, like someone was hoping that it would get stolen. It sounded like he may have contacted the non-emergency police number to report this car, though he may have called 911. It didn't specifically say. I just wasn't sure if he called 911 because I don't know, this is technically not a 911 type of a call. He told the dispatcher that he went to look at the cameras to see who abandoned the truck. And when he did, he saw that the guy who left the car looked pretty suspicious. It wasn't until May 8th, 2022, 5 days later, that investigators searching for Vicky and Casey got word about the truck being abandoned in Evansville, Indiana. So the U.S. Marshals in Alabama began to make their way there. In the meantime, one of the investigators started doing a video and digital canvas to see if they could find images and videos of the F-150 as it made its way from Tennessee to Indiana. The truck had Tennessee plates on it. One of the places that they looked was any type of camera that recorded license plates as vehicles traveled on highways and whatnot. across state lines. And they did in fact find several images of the F-150 as it headed towards Evansville. What they ended up noticing is that the F-150 was constantly being followed by a Cadillac sedan. In every image that they had of the F-150, the Cadillac was right behind it. And as they zoomed in on some of the images of the Cadillac, you could see that there is a blonde woman in the driver's seat, and they believe that blonde female to be the elusive Vicky White. But they can't say that it is a fact with 100% certainty. But the car wash that they left the F-150 at happened to have some pretty sharp cameras and a very good security system. So they were hoping to get a little bit more definitive proof that it was actually Vicky White herself in that car tailing the truck. It was on day 11 of the escape, May 9th, 2022, that the U.S. Marshals showed up at the car wash where the F-150 was found so that they could look at the security camera footage of the time when the F-150 arrived. And this is what really threw this investigation into gear. James Stitton said that his car wash had 16 cameras and there were no blind spots at all. So his cameras captured everything. And not only do we get to see video footage of Casey leaving the truck in the car wash bay, another camera pointed towards the street that the car wash was on captured images of that Cadillac again. The car drove through the car wash parking lot and parked at a nearby corner. It was the same color and style of Cadillac that they had been seeing as they tracked the F-150 on the freeway. And from there, you can see grainy footage of Casey White walking away from the truck and the car wash towards where the Cadillac was parked. So any small sliver of hope that Vicky was doing all of this under duress was pretty much over with, since they've now been able to confirm that for the past few days, Vicky had had access to a vehicle of her own where she could have just taken off and gone home. But she stood by her man, and he got into the Cadillac and off they went. Another thing investigators were able to glean from the video footage is that Casey is looking pretty good, like he's well put together. For a minute, they thought that Vicky and Casey were going to run off and hide into the woods, but based on the way that they saw him dressed, they quickly reconsidered that notion. In the video, you can see Casey wearing some khaki pants and a pink button-up shirt, and he's carrying a cell phone in his pocket, and he doesn't have a hat on. I mean, this guy isn't really seeming to be hiding from anyone. His hair is clean cut. He's clean. He certainly doesn't look like he's been struggling. But that's because they've got a lot of money with them, money from the sale of Vicky's house and her cashed out 401k and whatever else she had on hand, So they think they're staying someplace in the area, at some hotel or motel perhaps. Most fugitives don't have that kind of money available to them, so the marshals were searching all over Evansville because they figured, these people look like they're trying to stay at a hotel. And at that point, it was really all hands on deck. Everyone was looking for these two, and in just a matter of a few hours, they had a sighting. One local patrol officer there in Evansville, who knew to be on the lookout for the Cadillac, spotted it in a motel parking lot. And it just so happened that the motel was less than a mile away from the local sheriff's office and detention center. But at that point, they didn't know if Vicky and Casey were still in the area or if it was just another abandoned vehicle that they've run across now. Nobody knew if Vicky and Casey were inside a room at the hotel. And actually, authorities kind of doubted if they would still be in the area that many days later, but they must have really needed a rest or a break, or they got comfortable and decided that they were far enough ahead of law enforcement to stay put for a couple of days while they recharge and figure out what they're going to do next. And what they ended up doing is the marshals, along with the local law enforcement, they decided to stake out the motel around the clock to see what, if anything, would happen, because they figured the two of them can't stay in there forever. They're not even sure Casey and Vicky were still there, and they're sitting on the stakeout, even discussing the possibility that they're long gone and what their next moves are going to have to be. But before they even have all of their people in place to keep their eyes on that motel, they get word that Vicky and Casey actually came out of their room while law enforcement were still in the process of setting up their surveillance surrounding the motel. So they put it out over the radio. They were like, we see them. The both of them were very recognizable, of course. So after 11 days on the run as fugitives, authorities had finally seen the pair with their very own eyes. They decided to not pounce on them right away, and it was because of safety concerns. They knew that Vicky had made those weapons purchases in the days or weeks leading up to the escape. She had, to their knowledge, at the very least, her service weapon, a shotgun, and an AR-15. They decided that the best and safest course of action would be to bring in the SWAT team in order to take them into custody that way. But there was really no time to deploy the tactical team because Casey and Vicky went straight to their Cadillac and drove off, and they were driving at a pretty high rate of speed. One of the deputies that was part of the surveillance effort followed the pair in his patrol car and decided to go ahead and attempt to pull them over for a traffic stop. The officer followed the Cadillac for a distance until they got to a place where the officer felt like it was the closest and safest place to try and execute this traffic stop. The officer flipped on his lights for them to pull over, but they did not stop, and with that, the police chase was on. Casey was the one behind the wheel, and now the concern became what was going to happen next. They obviously weren't going to give up without a fight. They know that they're armed with some pretty serious weapons. Is this potentially going to turn out to be a shootout with police? That's exactly what investigators and authorities had feared. If you have a chance to look at the episode on this story on ABC, you will be able to see various video cameras around Evansville, Indiana, capturing moments of this police chase with the Cadillac. As law enforcement drove closely behind their vehicle, they could see Vicky through the back window, turning around and looking for something in the back seat. They assumed what she was looking for was a weapon, wondering if she was preparing to go out like Bonnie and Clyde. Well, as they were going, this chase got pretty intense, and they were staying very close to the fugitive's car. Most car chases that I watch on TV, most of which happen in Southern California, police tend to hang back and let the suspect set the pace. But these officers are really tailgating Vicky and Casey, so it looks really intense and dangerous. And as they're going along, the car that Vicky and Casey were in suddenly made a sharp turn into a grassy knoll, but the officers didn't let up and continued to follow them. Then there came a point in the pursuit on that grass that the Cadillac began to drift sideways. So the officer that was following closely behind them took a chance and rammed their Cadillac with his patrol car. When that officer rammed the Cadillac, just about simultaneously, a 911 call had came into the call center, and it was a call being made from Vicky's cell phone, which was the first time anyone had even heard Vicky's voice since this whole ordeal began. And in the call, it doesn't sound like Vicky is talking to the 911 operator, but rather to Casey. You can hear her say stop when the call is answered. And then she can be heard saying, please stop, the airbags are going to go off and kill us. It's then on the call you can hear the car as it crashed off the road and into a ditch. Vicky then lets off a short scream, and then she says, let's get out and run. We should have stayed at the fucking hotel. Then you can hear the deputy's vehicle as it crashes into them, and you can hear Vicky scream again shortly after that crash. The deputy then got out of his patrol car, and right then you hear a single gunshot. After that, Casey White showed his hands and decided to go ahead and give up, at which point he was swarmed by law enforcement and finally taken back into custody after 11 days on the run. There is footage of Casey being led up to the patrol car and taken by the vehicle's dash cam. He's walking with his hands cuffed behind his back. He's captured on the audio saying, "Help my wife. Is my wife okay? Please tend to my wife." Meanwhile, officers went to the other side of the vehicle where Vicky was located. You can't really see Vicky in the body cam footage, but one of the officers described her as laying towards the roof of the car on top of the passenger side door, which I'm not exactly sure what that looked like. The car crashed and it reportedly landed on its side, and it kind of crashed at a weird angle, so I'm not sure how Vicky ended up like that. When she was tended to at the scene, Vicky was unresponsive and had suffered one gunshot wound to the head. They weren't sure if she was still alive until one of the officers was able to observe that she was indeed still breathing. The initial reports that hit the media announced that the couple had been apprehended in Evansville, Indiana, and that Vicky had been shot. She was clinging to life and had been transferred to a local hospital. During that time, Casey was transferred to the local county jail. It wasn't until Vicky was being treated at the hospital that it was determined that she was mortally wounded. Vicky's family was given the news in person by Vicky's own colleagues before word started to spread on the news that she had in fact passed away. It wasn't clear at first if it was Vicky who shot herself or if it was Casey, but on the following day, May 10th, 2022, the medical examiner that conducted the autopsy found that the gunshot wound was in fact self-inflicted. Vicky's death was ruled a suicide. The gun was still in her hand when she was found laying on the vehicle. Vicky would not be coming back to Lauderdale County to face up to what she did. So now the only person that they have to tell their story was her lover, Casey. Vicky would be taking her side of this with her to her grave. In his interview after his capture, Casey told authorities about the 11 days that he was on the run with Vicky. He said that the majority of the time they were hiding in their motel room at the Motel 41 in Evansville, that the plan was to go out in a blaze of glory in a shootout with police, but they were unable to do that because they ended up crashing in that ditch, followed up by being rammed by that police cruiser. If they hadn't been captured, the plan was to continue to lay low. The drive to Evansville from Florence, Alabama is about the same distance as it is from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. It's a drive that takes about 4 to 4.5 hours. Casey told investigators that they made their way to Evansville and figured that they had gone far enough for the time being and wanted to rest for a while until they figured out what they were going to do next. They paid for 2 weeks at that Motel 41 at a cost of $50 a night. It had a 2-star rating on Google. Moldy walls and bed bugs, apparently. They discussed at length what might be the best place to go in order to blend in and be discreet. Probably nowhere, considering how tall dude was. According to an article about their capture on yahoo.com, it said, quote, "Cops found multiple red and blonde wigs the pair used as disguises, as well as a stash of guns and $29,000 in cash. They appeared to have blown through their money, as Vicky reportedly withdrew $90,000 in cash, the proceeds of the selling of her house, before they had escaped. The pair legally purchased the Ford pickup truck, but it is unclear how they obtained the Cadillac. There were never any signs that Vicky did any of what she did under duress. Casey would be extradited back to Alabama in order to face more charges." Casey White had been returned to the Lauderdale County Detention Facility on February 25, 2022, and that is when the countdown to their April 29th escape, a month and 4 days later, began. It is believed that the relationship had developed the last time Casey was being housed at the detention center, until a shank was found and he was transferred back to the maximum security prison in the summer of 2020. Earlier, I told you that the court document said that Vicky sold her house for around $45,000. Well, CNN reported that after their capture, she actually sold her house for a little more than $95,000, but that was still well under its market value of $235,000. After the sale of her house, Vicky moved in with her mother, Pat, about 5 weeks prior to the escape. In the weeks before the jailbreak, it was discovered that Vicky had gone shopping for men's clothing. She had also shopped at some adult novelty stores, and she purchased that dark orange Ford Edge, but used a false name in doing so. On Thursday, April 28th, on the day before the escape, records revealed that Vicky stayed at a Quality Inn near the detention center. Video surveillance showed her checking into the hotel, and it showed her parking the Ford Edge in that parking lot located approximately 10 minutes from the county jail. Vicky also submitted her retirement paperwork that day as well. The following morning, the day of the escape, April 29th, 2022, after Vicky's co-workers threw that impromptu retirement party for her, around 9:30 that morning, Vicky informed another deputy that she was planning on taking Casey to a mental health evaluation at the courthouse. and then she herself was going to see her doctor because she said she wasn't feeling well. So that is how Vicky accounted for the additional time that she was going to be gone, which was going to be forever technically. The investigation revealed that there was never an appointment at the courthouse for Casey that morning, and nobody said anything about the fact that per jail policy, inmates were supposed to be escorted by 2 deputies, clearing the way for Vicky to transport Casey by herself. Shortly after driving away from the detention center with Casey in the back seat, Vicky happened to drive by a member of the Florence City Council named Bill Griffin. He was outside filming a commercial for his particular district when he saw Vicky driving by with Casey in the back. He waved to Vicky because they were acquainted. She waved back at him twice before continuing on to wherever in the world Vicky thought she was going. From there, Vicky drove her patrol car to that shopping center 10 minutes away where she had planted that Ford Edge getaway car. She parked her patrol car there. They got into the Ford, which, like I said, Vicky parked there the evening before. The patrol car was discovered and considered abandoned by 11 a.m., but it doesn't seem like anyone started putting it together what had actually happened until several hours later. They spent some time trying to call Vicky's cell phone, but it kept sending their calls directly to voicemail. And this is when the other deputies at the jail started to become worried. It was very soon after that that they discovered Casey White had not been returned to the jail from his trip to the courthouse. The Ford Edge was discovered abandoned in the middle of the road in Williamson County, Tennessee, which is about 2 hours away from Lauderdale County. A tow truck driver named Robert Kimes towed it to his impound yard, having no idea where the vehicle had come from or what it had been used for. It was around 3:30 that afternoon that jail officials realized that Vicky and Casey were missing. An alert was posted on the Lauderdale County Sheriff's Office Facebook at 6 p.m. On May 1st, which would be day 3 of the escape, the U.S. Marshal Service offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to the capture of Casey White. At the time, Vicky was still considered missing and endangered. However, that would change the following day when a warrant for Vicky's arrest was issued, charging her with facilitating an escape in the first degree. Once they saw video footage of Vicky going straight from the jail to the getaway car, 10 minutes away without stopping, or an incident leading investigators to believe that this whole thing was planned and that Vicky was very much a part of the plan. The sheriff also told the media that the two had a special relationship in which Casey received extra food and privileges that the other inmates did not enjoy. And this was according to other inmates who witnessed their relationship happening in real time. Surveillance images that were being discovered were released to the media showing the Ford, Casey, and Vicky, along with descriptions of them, and another $5,000 was added to the reward fund. It was also announced that Vicky and Casey are considered to be armed and dangerous, and that they had information that they are likely armed with an AR-15. Information was also released in short order that the couple were then driving a dark blue Ford F-150, but then on May 3rd, which was day 5, that was when they found the abandoned F-150 at that car wash in Evansville and drove away in a Cadillac. The car wash manager called police about the F-150 the next day, which was day 6, and the vehicle was towed. This was also the day that Vicky White was officially terminated from her job as a corrections officer with the Lauderdale County Sheriff's Office. On May 5th, day 7, the U.S. Marshals released photos of Casey's tattoos. Some of them are said to be associated with an Alabama-based white supremacist prison gang called the Southern Brotherhood. On his back, Casey has a Confederate flag and the words Southern Pride on his chest in the shape of a shield with the initials SB and a swastika along with the letters SS in stylized lightning bolts. This was also the day that the tow truck driver who towed the Ford Edge recognized the vehicle on the news. He contacted his boss, who contacted their local law enforcement, and it was 11 p.m. that night when the U.S. Marshals arrived at that tow yard and confirmed that that was indeed the getaway car. The next day, on May 6th, other charges were added onto Vicky, and another warrant was issued accusing her of forgery and identity theft, which stemmed from her purchase of that Ford Edge using an alias. The governor of Alabama also added another $10,000, $5,000 for each fugitive, for information leading to their apprehension. 2 days later, on May 8th, that is when investigators were made aware of the F-150. After looking into that, authorities obtained video surveillance of Casey leaving the F-150 in the car wash bay and released those images to the media on May 9th. It was on that day that they also saw images of the Cadillac, and it would be just a few hours later that an alert Evansville police officer spotted that Cadillac parked at the Motel 41. Authorities began to set up the stakeout at the motel, and it was while they were in the process of setting up that Casey and Vicky emerged from their motel room while authorities looked on. They watched as the couple got into the Cadillac. A police pursuit ensued, which I described just moments ago, and it was shortly after that crash that Vicky shot herself in the head. She died at the hospital later that evening. Despite Casey referring to Vicky as his wife, they were not married, and he vehemently denied shooting her. The coroner would later confirm that. In the car, they found a total of 4 handguns, a semi-automatic rifle, 3 magazines, wigs, and $29,000 in cash. The next day, May 10th, Casey appeared in court virtually from the Vanderburgh County Jail, where he waived his extradition hearing and told the judge that he wanted to go back to Alabama. Casey was subsequently taken back to Lauderdale County, where he was arraigned on first-degree escape charges. The media was waiting for him outside when he emerged from the courthouse, but he didn't say anything to the journalists. After that, Casey was sent back to the William E. Donaldson Correctional Facility, which is where he is currently being housed since the beginning of 2022. On July 11, 2022, Casey was charged with felony murder in relation to Vicky's death, which was an interesting and controversial move on the part of the prosecutor, as Vicky's death was ruled a suicide. But because her death happened when they were in the middle of committing this felony, there are some technicalities woven into the felony murder charge that allows for potential murder charges to be brought against the survivor who was carrying out the crime with the decedent, even though they had nothing to do with the death. Casey was served the felony murder warrant at the prison. A trial date was set for December 12, 2022. It was subsequently postponed until June 17, 2023. However, Casey White reached a deal where he would plead guilty to first-degree escape. In exchange for that guilty plea, the felony murder charges related to Vicky White's death were dropped. And with that, the question remains, what about Connie Ridgway's murder? Well, according to a May 12, 2022 article in the independent.co.uk, it says, quote, capital murder suspect Casey White claimed that he was innocent of the brutal killing of 58-year-old mother of 2 Connie Ridgway almost as soon as he was captured, according to police reports. New documents released by the Vanderburgh County Sheriff's Office and seen by the Independent revealed that the 38-year-old career criminal began declaring his innocence of the shocking 2015 stabbing death while his jailhouse lover, Vicky White, was dying from a gunshot wound to the head. The convict had been taken to the hospital for treatment for a head injury, where he brought up the heinous crime that he was charged with, 2 counts of capital murder. But according to the officers who were at the scene of the capture of the fugitive and at the hospital where he was being treated, stated in their reports that Mr. White stated repeatedly that he did not kill Connie Ridgway, while he continued to ask about the condition of Vicky, who he was still referring to as his wife. Friends of Vicky remain baffled as to why she fled with her murder suspect boyfriend before killing herself as police closed in. There has been speculation that because of the loss of those 2 significant others that she had in her life over the years, her husband and her fiancé, that it was just more than she was able to take. Or perhaps she thought maybe this relationship that she developed with Casey was either going to make or break her. But to me, it sounded like she was already broken. Maybe Casey felt safe since he was behind bars and she didn't have to worry. Maybe she wanted to make this her last chance at love, and if it worked, then the 2 of them could run off and start a whole new life together. And if it didn't, she was ready to be done with her time in this world. I kind of like to see this tale as a love story, but at the same time, it isn't lost on me how much chaos and destruction and fear and possibly death Casey White caused and could have caused throughout his criminal career. And it is highly likely that he was using Vicky to escape, and he could have most likely had intentions of killing her once he was home free. At the same time, Vicky knew who she was getting involved with, and it didn't seem like she was afraid to shoot it out with police if it came down to it. A neighbor of Vicky's who grew up across the street from her and her family said that he would have never guessed she would have ever done anything like this. But, I don't think it's something that little girls dream about. Like, when I grow up, I want to become a corrections officer so I can meet the biggest, baddest, most violent and dangerous man in the world to live happily ever after with. It seems like that's a thing that develops over time. Once the seed was planted in Vicky's head that this is what she wanted and that Vicky White was who she wanted, she set what investigators described as one of the best laid jailbreak plans they'd ever seen into motion. And the more that went into the planning, the more exciting it became for her. And again, I get that. Vicky seemed to have lived a very simple life that heavily focused on her career until it didn't. As someone who isolated in her apartment in a foreign state, separated from my husband and my daughter and everything I ever knew in California, enduring COVID, the desert heat, and so much fear as to what I was going to do next in life and where I was going to go for the better part of 2020 through mid-2023, while trying to somehow numb all the hurt while I wait for my number to be up. I can really tell you that new people, places, and things, they come along when you really don't expect them to. And maybe Vicky White was what Vicky had been searching for her whole life. You just can't control how or where you find it. And in the end, what Vicky did wasn't right, and she and Casey put a lot of lives in danger. But that woman, she went after what she wanted, and she put it all on the line. And as wrong as her decisions may have been, I understand them. And in the same way, I'm similar in that I grab onto people, places, and things that I love, and I never ever want to let go. And that is all I've got for you, my dreamers, this week. This was the tale of the corrections officer and the convict. I hope you enjoyed diving into the details of the story as much as I did. And right now, I've been listening to the Prosecutors podcast with Brett and Alice, and they're in the midst of a 4-part series on D.B. Cooper. The unidentified skyjacker who hijacked a plane in 1972 and demanded $200,000 and some parachutes, and then skydived out of the plane and into infamy. It's a case that I really don't listen to podcasts about because it's a topic that's been talked about for so long that I just kind of have very little interest in it. But I took a chance on their series, and before you jump all over me for listening to their show because of their politics, I honestly don't care. I'm not listening to hear about who they're voting for this year. I listen because they're attorneys and they have so much knowledge to add to cases that we're even already so familiar with. So like I said, I took a chance on this D.B. Cooper series, and I'm glad that I did. And what's keeping me hooked is their interest and passion for this story that the two of them, the hosts of this show, have for what they talk about. And it's all of the little details that they get excited about that drags you in and gets you all excited about it as well. And there's a whole bunch of new things that they learn as they research for the episodes. And I feel the same way when I drop an episode and you all collectively moan like, ugh, not this story again. I get that a lot because I do tell a lot of familiar stories or stories that have been told a lot. But wow, I learn a lot about cases that I've never, covered before. I learn small details, and I'm in the same boat with you guys. And I hope that you all understand that and enjoy it and appreciate for what it is. Because if you don't like the topic that I put in the title, and I've been really trying to make sure that you recognize what you're getting into from just reading the title of the episode, you don't want it, you just pass it by. You can still download it though if you want, but you don't have to listen to it. But anyway, I hope all of you have a wonderful weekend and a happy Mother's Day. Today is Mother's Day. To everyone who fills that role in whatever capacity that you do it in. That's it. I want to thank you all for listening. Thank you for the bump in subscribers on Patreon. I could see that you are interested in the Seth Jackson case. So I'm going to head back to Florida from Alabama. I'm going to do that case out of Texas. What's the other one I was talking about? Probably Florida. But thank you again for listening. We're going back to Florida to work on Seth Jackson. I'll be back shortly with the next installment of your favorite Jamie Time podcast. Stay out of trouble. Don't end up in the county jail, but if you do, don't call me. I love you, and as always, sweet dreams.